Hey friends, you're watching BrainStormAcres. I'm Henry.
And I'm Irene.
Today I have a few things to do out in the greenhouse. I'm going to go do those and then we'll come back and we're going to talk about shortages.
Yep, supply chain interruptions.
We'd originally planned to let these tomatoes go. By go, I mean we were going to strip all the tomatoes off and shut the hydroponic system down. With a change in the weather forecast, it is a big deal because we were originally going to be down in the low 20s, which meant that in this area we'd be another 5 degrees lower, which would mean we'd probably be around 20 degrees. We didn't want to spend all the money heating the greenhouse all winter long. Propane is really expensive, so we were going to go ahead and just strip the tomatoes off and call it good, close the hydroponic system down for the winter. But then the weather forecast changed. Instead of being around 20 degrees here, it looked like it's going to be in the upper 20s, which meant that we could stretch a little while and keep this greenhouse warm enough. Well, it's worked so far. I'm about a week past when I'd normally planned to refresh the nutrients in this hydroponic system, so I'm going to go ahead and get that done now. Well, it isn't very hard. It doesn't take a lot of time. I have an old blender that I use out here in the greenhouse to mix up the nutrients. Some of them are pretty hard, and I'm trying to pulverize them down with some water so they go into solution more readily. That's it.
Shortly.
Now, did you know, Irene, that the genesis, the start of all the problems that we're having with things not getting to us here in the U.S. is based on 1930s Japan?
I think I've heard that rumor before, but I'll bet most people in the United States don't have a clue.
Well, I wonder how could you possibly have problems with not being able to get, I don't know, a box of cereal at the grocery store. How could that possibly relate to 1930s Japan?
Oh, I'll bet it has to do with the way you've organized your supply chain.
Well, that's in fact the case. Now, in the 1930s, Japan still hadn't had World War II yet, but Japan was an island. It's still an island.
Yeah.
But in 1930s, Japan didn't have real access to money. They're an island, they're a small island. And the problem with that is you can't afford cash to pay for inventory. And you don't have space to build big factories. So if you've ever watched the Ford Motor Company videos about the Red River plant, that's a huge.
Yeah, they bought thousands of acres and they could do what they wanted to because there was plenty of space, plenty of water, and everybody was excited to have them arrive, so they'd provide them with any infrastructure they needed.
So they were on the Great Lakes and they had cargo container ships, cargo ships come from across the Great Lakes and drop iron ore. and coal and other things like that on the dock. And that was fed into the Red River plant. So they had their own mills, they had their own smelting operations. They built everything from ore to a finished car. Now that meant that you had to have a lot of money to have all those bits of inventory held together. And you had to have a lot of space. Well, those are two things that Japan didn't have. So they came up with a really clever technique. It was called the Toyota Way. That was really put out in a book I think it was put out in the late 1930s, in Japan at least, and then it came to the US. Now the idea of the Toyota Way was that you have this small factory, you don't have a lot of space for inventory, so you don't have a lot of what's called work in progress, WIP. So you didn't have those things. You didn't need to have a lot of cash to finance all those things. And the idea then was you need to predict when pieces are going to arrive at the final assembly facility so that the work could continue in an unimpeded manner. Now, in the 1930s, Japan had high unemployment, so trying to manage labor costs weren't a big deal. But inventory of land were a big deal. Here we are in 2021. I took on this responsibility to manufacture these particular products. And one of the things I discovered was there was this huge backlog of broken things. Computer boards that had problems on them and nobody had taken the time to figure out what was going on because it was hard. It took time. But I had hundreds and hundreds of boards that were stacked up in a warehouse, well, small warehouse space, that were blocking up the space. I needed it for something else. So we ended up going through a lot of process to get rid of those boards. The details of that aren't important, but what was important was I started spending a lot of time reading all of these new reports about how to manage a business when it came to inventory and defective product and how to minimize all of those problems. And it worked great. The theory is fabulous. It worked extremely well. Really underlying all this was an ability to forecast how long it was going to take to make a specific part. Well, if we look at that box of cereal today, I don't know, maybe you're going to go buy a Cheerios type product at the grocery store. It's oats and maybe some sugar and a few other things.
That's about it, oats and sugar.
And it gets forced through an extruder, put into a package, and it ships to your store. Well, how come you can't buy it on the shelf sometimes?
Just-in-time delivery.
Just-in-time delivery. Remember, I said this approach was based on this Japanese learning that had happened over a 40 or 50 year period of time.
Japan is a small space in comparison to the United States, very small. They don't have the Rocky Mountains, they don't have the Sierras, they don't have massive storms that come down out of Canada and sweep through the Midwest and bury everything in snow or blow it away with a tornado. When I was a kid at home, 1960s.
You're that young?
Right. Anyway, all grocery stores had storerooms. And that storeroom was like boxes and boxes of everything he could afford to buy and stuff back there. He always, to him a nightmare was you have a cold snap and it's the weekend and you run out of tomato soup. Everybody had storage. The grocery stores were not huge, but they would have the biggest warehouse they could afford behind them to stack boxes and boxes of stuff. You know a blizzard's coming, you make sure you've got a few more cans of soup, you make sure you've got this, you make sure you got that. In the 60s or 70s, you might see the shelves get pretty cleared out, but most of the time they'd have enough back stock. They just couldn't stock it fast enough. But now there is no stock. When I go to Walmart, and I'll pick on Walmart because I was there last week, and I looked around to see what was going on, as I always do. And sometimes you go and there'll be one thing on the shelf and there's nothing behind it. Or if they've completely filled that section, if they have anything left over, they will put it up on the top shelf, and they don't want you to get the stuff down off that top shelf. You're supposed to get an employee. But that's all they've got. There isn't another warehouse out in back where they've got rows of cases of stuff. That's all they've got.
So the 40-year-ago experience and 50-year-ago, wow.
Yeah, I know.
Ago experience that we had was related very closely to this inventory management strategy that was developed by the Japanese because they had no choice. So there's been a big change in how product is distributed throughout the community, whether it's a huge city or a smaller town. There's been a big change. A lot of that is based on financial incentives. There are a lot of models that go on, a lot of ways about doing business that go on that are really aimed at having the most dollars per square foot out of a store. So there's reasons why things have changed. But let's look now at the question of getting a new freezer or a new refrigerator or something else that's a larger scale product, and why things don't show up in the home stores and the big box stores.
Right. We know people who've been waiting for tractors. We know other people who've been waiting for refrigerators or stoves or something like that. I mean, it's kind of gotten to the point where if you can go into a big box store and buy the floor model, that's your best bet.
What most people don't realize is almost half of the goods that come into the U.S., that are imported in the U.S., come through the California coast terminals. In the past 18 months, there's been a huge shift in what people are spending their money on.
Before March of 2020.
That's exactly the time. Before then, people were spending their money on services. They'd be going out to a restaurant, they'd be going to the movies, they'd be going a lot of different places. And after March of 2020, that started changing, and eventually changed in a big way. So people have started buying hard goods. So they're buying new refrigerators. They're redecorating their own home themselves. They're buying all kinds of home improvement supplies. If you look at the current shortage on imported goods, a lot of people will say, oh, it's because of reason A, or reason B, or reason C, or it's some big conspiracy, or it's something that the Chinese are doing, or something that the Latvians are doing, or something the Russians are doing. I'm here to tell you that the shortages that are caused in container shipments have no single big cause. There's a lot of reasons. You know, when that cargo container ship was stuck in the Suez Canal for a week or more, or something around that.
Yeah, I think it was a couple of weeks.
That cargo container had more than 20,000 cargo containers on it.
That's a lot of stuff. And when it's not just the ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal, it's all the guys behind him. It really screwed things up. I remember that Suez Canal. It was really affecting supplies in Europe in particular, but there were certain things that they were warning were going to become hard to get here too.
So let's tie all this back to, actually I have a lot of good friends in Japan. I did a lot of business with Japan. I had a design operation in Japan and other places around the world, but let's go tie this back to the Japan
model
strategy to control costs, to control loss, to maximize profits, all those things that were forced on them by their physical location. The Japanese method, the Toyota approach, really worked well when you had some reasonable ability to predict how long each thing was going to take to get from point A to point B. It still works very well when you have predictability. But once things start going wrong, when you start having cargo containers having to wait for extra weeks to get offloaded in Long Beach, or when you have a shortage of big rig drivers, which is what we have right now in the U.S. There's too few truck drivers available to haul things coast to coast or even regionally. When those things start happening, the predictability starts going away. In fact, not just starts going away, it goes away completely. If you want to hear more about how this all works and what can happen as a result of that, leave a note below. There's a whole lot more. I don't want to go into it right now because it really complicates things. But at the very end of everything, the model assumes that you have a predictable, uniform flow of goods from start to finish, from the initial start of production to the final consumer, from the original oats that are made into those Cheerio-type products to your kitchen table.
Right.
That all should be predictable, and should be predictable within some reasonable tolerance, some reasonable amount of additional delay. When you don't have that predictability, you don't have predictable supply at the end.
A lot of the problems that were happening in the United States were called what we call bean counters. Everything comes down to the bottom line. They don't care about service. They don't care about the customer. They don't care about their employees. They don't care. The loss of their sense of responsibility that corporations have is an integral part of our problem. It's all about the beans. You have these people who are too high level who are not tuned in. You know, so you have it's like Henry said, there's a million reasons there's issues. It's not one thing.
Yeah, so when something goes wrong, and one of the things you learn when you do failure analysis as a profession is that you learn that there are very few catastrophes that happen because of one very specific thing that goes wrong. It happens, but it's very seldom one specific thing. There's usually one thing, and that was caused by another thing, which was caused by 3 other things, which was caused by 50 other things. Hey, you know what time it is?
It is.
Time to say goodbye, Irene.
Yes, and we have work to do in the yard. Jack is enthralled with the pile of goo that used to be sweet potato plants.
As long as he doesn't roll in it.
No, so far he hasn't had the urge, but he does pee on it every day. And I want to get that out of the way because it's that I think I will put in the compost pile. I'm going to need a feed shovel to pick it up. It's just totally disintegrating into goo, which is not something we don't see around here very often. But every time it freezes, it gets a little gooier, so I've got to get that out of the yard.
Say goodbye, Irene.
So until next time, be sure to like, subscribe, hit that notification bell because obviously we have tons more going on.
Are you sure?
I am. I already said that once. So until next time, bye.
Bye.